Okay, I think I'm gonna start. Okay, thank you everybody for joining our panel discussion today. My name is Misamuro Hochi, I'm General Manager of North American Post, and this event is hosted by Hokubei Hochi Foundation and North American Post Publishing in the collaboration with Bellevue Collage Japan Week, which is happening this week. First, I'd like to thank Bellevue College for this opportunity. To start, I'd like to share a presentation that I'm gonna explain a bit about us and history of Japanese and Asian American history in our region. Okay. So history overview. So North American Post Publishing, we have a really long history, which is very amazing. It was started by first generation Japanese immigrants in 1902. And as you can see this picture, this was taken in 1913 in front of the office of North American Post on the Main Street, which is so-called Nihonmachi today. And a bit about myself, I joined the company in 3 years ago, and I've been in the publishing industry a long time, but at the same time, prior to joining the company, I studied urban planning at the University of Washington. And my thesis theme was about international district community design, where I studied a lot about Japanese American history and the district's history of Asian American. And oh, I'm getting a little nervous. So for me, it was very interesting for me because like I'm Japanese expat, and prior to that, I really didn't expect American history having Japanese or American involvement like us. And as you see, like this panel, Asian American immigration started a lot earlier than many of us think. So first Chinese Seattle resident arrived in 1860. And as you can see in this picture, it was when it was a pioneer year, like Henry Yasser started lumber business in our community. So Chinese businessmen and laborers were part of our early pioneer of our region. But unfortunately, in 1886, very violent anti-Chinese riot happened in our region. And because of that, many Chinese people escaped from our region to California. But still, our region was expanding. So So there was they needed cheap labor from Asia, and that was why Japanese immigration started, and it increased until 1924. And this is a Jackson Street, and this street used to be filled with many Japanese businesses, and international district today was filled with many successful businesses. But when Japanese became a major minority group in a region, anti-Japanese agitation started to happen. Anti-Japanese League of Washington was founded in 1916. And then they worked hard for the lobbying to get rid of Japanese laborers and business people out of different industries. And as a result, two very discriminational laws were enacted in our region. And 1921 Alien Land Law banned land ownership of foreigners. And at the same time, Immigration Act in 1924 banned immigration from Japan, Asian countries, including Japan and Asia. And you can see kind of this newspaper, and there are many anti-Asian, anti-Japanese campaigns held by major newspapers in Seattle. So this is a picture I wanted to share today because this is a farm in Bellevue, and not only the city side of Seattle, many Japanese lived in countryside and stayed successful in strawberry and fruits and vegetable farmings in our region. And Filipinos was the third influx to our region from Asia. Their population increased a lot after 1924 to replace the labor market from Chinese and Japanese immigrants. And this picture, Filipino Cafe, was the center of Manila town, which used to exist inside of International District. And in 1942, when the war started, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to incarceration camp. This is King Street inside of International District. And this is again Jackson Street. This street used to be filled with Japanese businesses, but it was gone in a week. And this exclusion of Japanese happened very in short term. So Japanese Americans had to either get rid of or sell at a very cheap price of what they worked hard to build up since they moved from Japan. So this is the last panel of me, and the good things started to happen after the war. In 1960, the discriminational law was ended, especially the hard lobbying by Japanese American Citizenship League, JACL. 1970s was a big wave of Asian American civil rights movement, which Elaine will talk a lot about during the panel. In 1980 was the very important decade for Japanese American in order to gain official apology from American government for the incarceration during the war. Okay, so here I'd like to introduce two panels today. Elaine Ikoma, she was heavily involved in 60s and 70s civil rights movement in Seattle. And also she was one of the founder of Interim CDA, which is today providing affordable housing and community services in the International District. And Stanley is president of JACL Seattle chapter. JACL is actually the oldest minority advocacy organization in our nation, since it started in 1920 in Seattle. And the organization today advocates for wider minority group, especially the minority immigrants in our region and nationwide. So I close my presentation for now. Thank you, Elaine and Stan. Okay, so first, can you please explain a bit more about the organizations you're representing? Like Elaine, can you tell me about Interim?
Sure. Hi, everyone. You can see me, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, thank you all for joining us. It's really great that there's a lot of interest I do want to make a couple clarifications. I was not one of the founders of Interim.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. You're aging me even more. Interim has been around since, actually they started in the late 60s. And it's a really interesting history, which I can mention a little bit more about. But today it is one of the oldest, in fact, I think it is the oldest nonprofit advocacy and service agency in the Chinatown International District. So it's really exciting that, I call them legacy organizations because they really have survived and thrived. And we'll talk a little bit more about Interim, but I just really want to say that I'm really proud to be part of, uh, of Interim and on the board right now. But I've had a long history with the organization.
Thank you, Elaine. Stan, can you explain a bit about JACL and
Sure.
Seattle chapter?
Yeah, sure. The Japanese American Citizens League actually formed in 1929, but the Seattle chapter was an independent organization that formed in 1921.
Okay.
So Seattle chapter actually predates the national organization by a few years. And we're actually not quite the oldest civil rights organization because I believe the NAACP formed in 1909. So they're a little bit older than us, but we're pretty close.
Okay.
Yeah, so originally the JACL was formed as a citizens league, so it's more of a civic organization to get people involved in registering to vote, voting, and involved in jury duty and other civic citizenship type of activities. It kind of shifted when the war broke out and the orders came down to take everyone away. And then it had to step into a role because all the Issei leadership was taken away. So the JACL was looked upon as, and it was also the only national organization at that time to lead the Japanese community. So then after the war, a lot of the activities became more civil rights oriented, trying to get citizenship for the Issei generation, trying to overcome the discrimination in jobs and housing that people faced when they came back, that kind of thing. And then it progressed on through that. So Seattle chapter has always been one of the most active. I think it's the oldest chapter.
This is why I've been reading in the books. Thank you. So first, I'd like to ask questions to Elaine about civil rights movement in our region. I mean, Asian American civil rights movement in the industry in our region, and how were you involved in the movement? Can you tell me more about it?
Sure. One of the audience participants has asked us to speak louder. So if everybody can increase their volume, and I don't know if my volume's up loud enough, but just tell us if it's not. And also, I think Misa did mention, and Stan also mentioned in the chat, if you have questions, please type them in and Misa will call on you and you can unmute yourself later to ask your questions. So the first set of questions are to me. So I'll be doing most of the talking in the beginning, and then Stan will have a lot of his questions and answers as well. So I guess to start, Misa asked what my involvement and when it began. Specifically, probably about 73, 74. And got involved with the community through the UW campus, because at the time, of course, there was a lot of activism off of the civil rights movement. So got really active with the Asian Student Coalition. We really were having a lot of meetings and really active on campus. So that was my first involvement. It was kind of just more friends that got first get you involved, and then you become, a lot more aware and politicized at that point. So that's kind of really the start. And then in September of 75, Uncle Bob Santos hired me at Interim, and that started my actual work at Interim. Went on to establish the International District Housing Alliance back in 77. I wish I was smiling in that camera photo, but Sherry Wu was also on the call here, and she looks better than I do. But you know, we're both like in our early 20s, as a lot of people were back then when we were active. So we did know at that time that we really needed to organize residents. And I'll talk more about what was going on in the district at the time, but I guess that's really was the impetus to start the International District Housing Alliance. Left after about 8-9 years and came back into the community, and Uncle Bob hired me back in 2001, and then went on to become the executive director of Interim CDA after he retired, which actually he's retired many times.
This was. Can you tell us a bit about Bob Santos? Because you know, many of us knows about him, but some students may not.
Yeah, you know, I think that's getting into some of my other parts, Lisa. So why don't we? Because I'd like to talk about the Asian American Civil Rights Movement in the 60s first, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah, we'd like to know what was so unique in Seattle.
Yeah, I think why I wanted to really talk about the civil rights movement was that, you know, even though some of us didn't get involved until the 70s, really it started sooner and earlier than that. And I want to send a message that, you know, we really stand on the shoulders of past activism and past activists, because a lot of things that we take for granted, I mean, you know, we think things are bad now, but, you know, there's a lot of things that we do take for granted. And so this photo, and Tony Ogilvy's on this chat here, this forum here. Tony, this is you when you're 24, you said. And I think the thing about this was the late 60s, and there was a lot of activism that came off of the civil rights movement in Seattle. And so I think what's significant about this, you know, the Asian Coalition for Equality, it was Pan-Asian, even back in the 60s. And if you look at what was going on there, and in that photo is Larry Matsuda as well, and Larry's still around as well, is making demands for Asians to be included as minorities on campus and getting the treatment of the special recruitment. And, you know, there wasn't a lot of Asians at UW. And so there was a lot of demands. And I think that a lot of us who came onto the campus later, I mean, we owe a debt of gratitude to the activists in the 60s, because, you know, the EOP program, a lot of us got aid and grants and got accepted through those programs that weren't there before. So, you know, another thing that was happening in the 60s was the first Human Rights Commission. And even though I wasn't active at the time, I want to mention that because, you know, there was a lot of Asians and Japanese Americans included. Phil Hayasaka, who just passed away, was one of the key first directors of the Human Rights Commission, and also was one of the founders of the Asian Coalition for Equality. And there's just a lot of people who may not still be around to speak to all the great work that was done in the 60s to really lay the foundation for what came later.
And they're kind of second generation Asians that time? Or
yeah, there were Filipinos, Chinese, and Japanese mainly. You know, a lot of the Niseis were pretty active. And the Sanseis, you know, and the younger people, we were, you know, all in our 20s.
You're Sansei, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so so just another thing too, talking about the 70s and what was unique, I think, you know, I think that those of us who grew up in this area know that, you know, we grew up together with Blacks and Asians, and
okay.
You know,
so the next slide you sent to me, you know.
Yeah. So we worked together. I think that the 60s and 70s really saw a lot of activism by a lot of different groups and individuals on a lot of different issues. So this article, the UW Daily, again, it's the same era, because you see Tony Ogilvy in the photo, and I think there's Larry Matsuda, but then note that Larry Gossett is there, and really shows that there was a lot of multiracial unity, supporting Afro-American studies. You know, the Asians were supporting each other. So I think that this photo, I wanted to make sure to, you know, recognize that there was a lot of that interaction and support going on. Now, just a little bit about the 70s. You know, again, I just want to say that it was Pan-Asian. A lot of the activism on campus. I remember when in 73, when I was just getting involved, we started writing for our own Asian newspaper. It was first called the Kapasanan, and then it became the name Asian Family Affair. And I remember, and Sherry, well, you can remember this too, we wrote for the newspaper, and that was before, you know, really a lot of the uh, other activities were going on. So, you know, it was a time where the 70s were just building on what was going off of the 60s, I think, in a lot of multiracial, um, much like we see today. But back in the 70s, that was a big deal, you know, where the Asians were all working together and supporting each other, grew up together, you know.
I just wondered that UW student was like as diverse as it is today.
Well, you know, again, because the programs weren't in place for, you know, really targeted recruitment, no, there weren't as many. And so that was where, you know, now we can see the fruits of what was done back in the 60s and 70s. But I do want to mention that, you know, a lot of the Asians and Blacks, and well, back then it was Chicano, you know, and Native Americans and whites all lived together close by, because, you know, that was where, you know, because of the discriminatory housing laws, that's where we concentrate. So they're really, you know, my father went to Garfield and my mother went to Franklin. So, you know, there you go. And the Japanese American community, you know, was just massive. It just covered all the way up through the central area as well. So it was just, yeah.
So international district was kind of center of that community.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And then like my next question is like, yeah, like you started to mention about like why international district was so important, so significant for Asian American history.
Yeah, I think as interim, talking about the formation of interim in late 60s, you know, really the deterioration of the community was going on at the time. You know, yeah, this is 71, but even before that, the community was really experiencing a lot of deterioration. Stan's going to talk more about the incarceration, but that really devastated the Japanese American community. And then the
I-5 construction as well.
Well, the 1965 was when the I-5 freeway cut the neighborhood in half. So I think my point is that even in the 50s and the 60s, that really impacted the size and the vitality of the community. So by the time that the late 60s and the 70s hit, there was a lot of deteriorated housing, and small businesses were struggling, a lot of crime. So it was not a good situation in the international district. So with this slide, the 1971, this was the groundbreaking of the Kingdom. You can see, you know, that that was a really famous demonstration, because that was supposed to be where, you know, it was like you're breaking ground on building a kingdom in our neighborhood. But you can see a lot of the young Asian activists here protesting that groundbreaking. And that was quite, you know, significant event that kind of really sparked a lot of the other activism that came after that.
Okay.
So this slide again, so we organized, this was more later in the mid 70s. You know, the Alaska Cannery Workers Association with Nemesio Domingo, really was involved. So was the International District Youth Council. And I should mention IDEC, the Emergency Center with Donnie.
Mm.
And came together and put together some demands. Back then, it was just really easy. You just put together demands, and you just say, hey, you got to meet these demands. And so this demonstration, and I'm in the photo on the left there, as is a lot of other activists. This was later. This was another march to the county.
I understand that the demand was a lot about like affordable housing and community services funded by the regional government.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Affordable housing. And we had a set of demands to, hire workers at the Kingdom, because the Kingdom was already getting built. There was demands for funding for health services and free tickets to games and events, and, a lot of different demands. And I think out of that came a lot of the social services that have blossomed, had gotten built in the neighborhood as a result of a lot of the activism.
Understand that the interim CDA was built based on that demand, and then like a movement, the lobbying to the government to fund more in the international district in the American community. But can you tell me more about the foundation of interim and how you are involved?
Yeah. So the interim. I think what was significant about interim was that it kind of developed and followed the early activism. Actually, it started in '69. The Jackson Street Community Council actually was the precursor to interim. And actually it was run by small business owners. Like, I'm not sure if Donnie's dad, Don Chin, was there, but I know Tomio Moriguchi was involved, in Ben Wu, and a lot of the business owners. And then in a 68, I believe, was when interim started, was really struggling, I believe, in funding and whatnot. In 71, Uncle Bob Santos got hired, and this is where I can talk a little bit more about Bob and his work, because he really helped shepherd the agency. While a lot of us were organizing tenants and residents, what he was doing a lot of negotiations, and he was just brilliant when it came to strategy and negotiating things. And so he was able to really help develop and lead interim along with lots of other people. I mean, when I think back of all the people that I know today, I mean, every single person just about had some involvement in activism and taking lots of different forms. So it wasn't just a few of us. But, a lot of the agencies came out of the struggle, and interim was key in a lot of them. Denise Louis, Child Development Center, the clinic, yeah, a lot of the services. The Danny Wu Garden was one of the great examples of building an urban garden. I think that was back in '75. Danny Wu, Bob was able to get Danny Wu, when they were sitting at the bar at Quang Tuck or whatever, to donate the whole land for $1 a year. So and to this day, it's just a wonderful urban garden. So a lot of the affordable housing in Hirabashi Place here, people in Stan can talk more about Gordon Hirabashi and what he did around the incarceration and defying the curfew. But this is one of the most recent affordable housing projects that has his name in memory of him. And that's built right at the edge of Nihomachi, the old Nihomachi. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. I think it's very, very fascinating and an amazing, interim has been serving for the community so long since it started. And now I kind of like to move to questions to Sam. And it's a lot more about what happened in 1980s. Redress. So Redress, you moved to Seattle 1981.
Correct.
Yeah. Right? So can you tell me more about that age and, how, JCL and you were involved in the movement in Seattle?
Sure. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Let me see. People asking to speak louder. So maybe try to speak louder.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Seattle JCL actually started working on redress many years before I arrived. Redress had been talked about since about the late 60s, largely by Edison Uno in San Francisco, but Seattle folks took it up in the mid 70s. There was a committee formed with Shosuke Sasaki, Henry Miyatake, Chuck Kato, and 2 or 3 other folks who came up with an actual plan. I mean, not just, we should ask for an apology, but an actual plan to get redress. And they presented it to Congressman Mike Lowry. They got the support of the Seattle chapter JCL, presented it to new Congressman Mike Lowry in '78. He introduced the bill. It did not pass, but that was the first redress bill introduced. I think that same session or the next session, the national JCL helped introduce a bill to set up a study commission, blue ribbon commission that would study the incarceration and removal of Japanese to determine whether a wrong was done, and if so, what a proper remedy might be. So that was the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. When I got here in summer of 1981, that commission was holding its hearings in Seattle at Broadway Performance Hall, the old Broadway High School. And so I spent 3 days attending those hearings and taking photos, some of which ended up in the International Examiner. And then a year or two after that, I was hired as a part-time office assistant at the district office of the Pacific Northwest District of Japanese American Citizens League, and worked with Karen Saraguchi there, and met all of the local players, and there were a lot of people involved in redress. It started slowly, like that small committee of 5 people, and then Seattle chapter JCL joined, and then they had to start recruiting all the other community organizations, the churches, major community leaders and stuff. And it was a slow process because at first everyone was really hesitant to do it.
You mean like that Issei, like old, like Issei generation who were really?
Issei and Nisei generation were hesitant. Some people felt like it raises a lot of painful issues that they don't want to deal with. Some people felt like it would cause a backlash, that if we asked for an apology, then we would experience the same discrimination and hate that we had experienced before the war and during the war. And I think the commission hearings really turned that around, because people came and testified, and actually, the government was interested in hearing what actually happened to you. And then people were honest, and they spoke out, like, I lost my business, I lost my farm, my family got split up, my friend or my family member died in camp, and all these terrible things came out about what had happened to people. And then it became okay to talk about it, because there was this lid of silence on the whole community for decades. So once we were able to talk about it, we were able to get more people involved and more organizations. Eventually, the entire community backed it. And by 1988, we were able to actually pass a redress bill, which was signed by President Ronald Reagan, which was a big surprise, because everyone was thinking, conservative Republican, there's no way he's going to sign a redress bill that's going to give $20,000 to anyone and everyone who was actually locked up or removed during World War II. But we were able to convince him, and he signed it.
Can you share, like, do you remember some of like stories during the hearing session that kind of you remember?
Yeah, there was one of my friends, Shiz, who I met when she worked at Cato Nursing Home, but a woman told me that she was a young girl when Pearl Harbor happened, and she remembers living in the area near Cato Nursing Home, and her neighbor's father was taken away by the FBI. The family is standing on the sidewalk crying as they take him away, put him in a car, and they didn't know where they were taking him, and I don't think they saw him for a year or two. But that really traumatized her. And then after she got taken away with her family and sent to Minidoka in Idaho, one of her best friends ended up drowning in the river because she went swimming, or the canal. And that really haunted her for like the rest of her life. And, you know, just stories like that came out. And a lot of people told about how, you know, almost all the old hotels in the International District and even Pioneer Square area before the war were either owned or managed by Japanese families. And all of those were taken away during the war, and very, very few were able to retain it after. Panama Hotel was one of the few by the Hochi family that stayed within.
Like, what did the kind of Redress mean to Japanese American community? Like, you know, I just slightly explained about the incarceration in my earlier presentation, but like, do you have any like thoughts you wanna share here?
Yeah, well, the incarceration, forced removal and incarceration during World War II was a real slap in the face. It was, especially for the American-born Japanese like my parents, who thought that they were US citizens with equal rights, with constitutional rights. It was really hard for them to understand why the government would violate its own constitution and take them away and then lock them up. It was really hard for the adults to lose their jobs, their education, their family, integrity, their homes, their businesses, their farms, and then have to come back basically for most of them with nothing to try to rebuild after the war. And to live with that, I think it caused a tremendous amount of trauma within families and within the community as a whole. And there was a lot of cultural suppression after the war because of that. Like, I wasn't taught Japanese growing up, and part of the reason was because the Nisei generation, second generation, felt like it'd be safer for the kids if they didn't speak Japanese so they wouldn't stand out so much. And so, and if you didn't do Japanese things, so there was a lot of cultural suppression going on in the 50s and 60s. That started turning around with the civil rights movement and Black Power and people starting to reclaim, yeah, we should be proud of who we are rather than be ashamed of who we are and just aspire to be white, because that would never happen. I mean, we're not white. So anyway, so Redress kind of brought all that to a head, and people, I think, really felt that they could be, actually, some Nisei said, for the first time, I really feel like an American. Or I feel like, you know, that I'm a real citizen of the US after Redress. I have a friend whose mother was Issei. She got her Redress check and the letter that came with it, with the apology. And so it's a $20,000 check, right? So my friend goes and says, "Oh, Mom, did you get the check?" And she says, "Yeah, it's somewhere." And she had to go look under the table and go through the mail to find the check. But her mother had already put the letter of apology in a frame and hung it on her wall. So
yeah, just to add, my grandma was in the camps, you know, and can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And you know, it was tough because you know, she had a nervous breakdown, miscarriage. These are things they don't talk about. The day after she passed away, I went to the mailbox and there was the check. So I'll always remember that, you know, that's the travesty of what happened to our families.
Yeah. Yeah, you had to be alive to receive a check, or you had to be alive when they mailed it in order to receive it.
Right.
Redress.
In 1980s, you started the very wonderful annual event in Seattle, which is from Hiroshima to Hope
right.
at Green Lake. No, you're involved, you know, in Kukon Taiko as well. So sounds like after the Redress and the, you know, that happens, you felt a little more involved.
Yeah, so actually it was going on at the same time. The 80s were a really active time. So in the early 80s, there was a big anti-nuclear movement going on because of the US was going to put cruise missiles in Europe, and the Soviets were getting really antsy about it. And there were like million-person marches in Europe to protest the cruise missiles going in because they thought that would trigger a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So we decided to do, in I think it was 83 or 84, maybe 84, JACL to do a Hiroshima memorial program. And we asked Congressman Mike Lowry to be our keynote speaker because he was active in opposing the placement of those cruise missiles and other forms of war preparation within Congress. So he spoke at Blaine Methodist Church, and we got about 300 almost entirely Japanese Americans to attend that first Hiroshima memorial event. It carried on. We continued to do it at different locations for several years. In 88, we did a lantern floating in Frosh Pond at University of Washington in conjunction with the JACL National Convention that was happening there. And then I believe in 89, we moved it to Green Lake. And other people like Martha Bryce and Shirley Shimada are really active. Mary Hansen are very active anti-nuclear activists who've been involved in From Hiroshima to Hope for a long time. But since 89, I believe, it's been at Green Lake every year until this year because of COVID-19, where we launch, we make paper lanterns that we float on Green Lake, and it's with calligraphy on it. We have calligraphers who volunteer their time, and they write messages in kanji that say things like peace, love, harmony, remembrance, and you can write your family member's name on it if you want as well, and then we float them out on Green Lake. So we've been doing that program for, I don't know, over 40 years now. This year we had to do it virtually on video like this instead of in person.
Yeah, thank you. And today, JACL is more, you know, not only Japanese Americans. You guys advocate for wider minority group, especially minority immigrants. Can you tell me, you know, the reason?
Yeah.
Behind?
Yeah. So JACL has been active in a new organization, a new network of organizations called Tsuru for Solidarity. And that was formed in 2019. It actually started the precursor started in 2018, but was prompted by first the Muslim ban that was trying to prevent all Muslims from being allowed into the United States, and that targeting of a particular group based on religion, similar to targeting an entire group based on ethnicity, triggered something within a lot of folks in the Japanese American community, because it reminded them of how they had been vilified like right after Pearl Harbor. And then the next year, when they had the zero tolerance policy, where they were separating children from their families at the southern border, that reminded everyone of how families got separated during World War II. You know, usually it was the fathers that were taken away, and no one knew where they were going. And then incarceration of children, which happened during World War II. And then just mass incarceration, thousands and thousands of people. And not because they had done anything really wrong, it's just based on a lot on racial animus, racial hostility, and discrimination against immigrants, particularly those who are brown-skinned from south of the border. And so for all those reasons, it seemed to us like locking up children, separating families, mass incarceration of people just struck a nerve and said, you know, when that happened to us in World War II, there were no organizations that really stood up and said, we can't do it. There were no marches, there were no protests, there were no petitions. So when we did Redress, we had always been saying, never again, like this should never happen again. And now it's happening right in front of us. So it's kind of like we have a moral authority to speak about those things because our community went through very similar things in the 1940s. So with that authority, we also have a moral responsibility to speak out and be the friends that we did not have in 1942. And so that's what we're trying to do, is stay true to our mission and stay true to our heritage, our history, to help others the way that we wish someone had been there to help us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stan and Elaine. And the last question I'd like to ask you too is, how do you relate like 70s and 80s movement to the current situation, you know, including pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement? How what's the result from the movement in the past? Maybe Elaine, can you answer?
Well, yeah, you know, I don't have any magic bullet. You know, when I look back on, you know, the activism, modern day activism would be, you know, the 60s and 70s. And then I think we all agree, you know, that was a transformational time in the country. There was nothing ever like that in modern day history. And now we look at what's going on now and it looks a little different. I mean, the same injustices are there. It's systemic. It's going to be the same. But I think it is potentially really another transformational moment. Because if you look at, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, the police killings, you know, those all things were happening already, the police killings all along. It's just that now it's for the whole world to see. And so that's different. And I think as Stan said, you know, we were looking for friends back in the 40s, and now we can see that people do see, you know, the police killings and all of the racism and whatnot. And then you couple that with an incredible pandemic that on our lives we haven't seen to this extent. It's just mind-blowing, the number of deaths and what's going on. And then it's mind-blowing also to see the impact on the, you know, people of color and the communities that are least able to handle, already have huge health disparities and whatnot. These are things that we all know, but that's just that's just transformational. I mean, and then you have the climate crisis where our world, our globe is burning up. That's something that, you know, those of us who are our age, you know, we think about our kids and, you know, grandkids and the future generations that are having to deal with this. So, you know, it's just an incredible moment. And I think that the young people do lead. They always have. When we were in the 60s and 70s, you know, we were all in our 20s. You know, we didn't own homes, we didn't have kids, we worked around the clock, we were out on the streets constantly. And so I think the young people today are stepping forward. Not to say that that's all the only people stepping forward, but I really think that the movement needs to continue because, you know, we talk about voting, you know, and a lot of, you know, we were revolutionary back then, a lot of us, and, you know, we didn't really believe in voting, but, you know, you have to vote. It's not like it's the solution, but it's part of what needs to happen. There's still a lot of activism on the streets that need to happen. And that's the only thing that really makes a big difference, I think. But I think there's parallels, but this is a really, really um, a moment of just unparalleled issues. And I think that I'm inspired though, because I really think that the young people are so incredibly dedicated, smart and sharp. A lot of them are very educated. And I think that, you know, they're doing the right thing in taking the lead.
Thank you, Elaine. How about you, Stan?
Well, I definitely agree with Elaine. I believe this is a transformative time because of everything that's going on, and it's both a time of great risk and also a time of great opportunity. So, right now, the way the political things are going on, I think we are at risk for losing democracy in the United States. So, participation, voting is really, really important, and participation in the census, all of that is really important because we're in danger of losing that. On the other hand, it's also a period of opportunity because things are so up in the air due to the pandemic, due to the economic crisis that the pandemic caused, due to the Black Lives Matter movement, which has caused upheaval all across the country. A lot of things are up in the air, and also a lot of things that we never thought were possible. Like, you know, we said, well, you know, we can't give unemployment to everybody in the country because that would just be too expensive. But we did it. You know, we said, well, you know, we can't promise tests and treatment to everybody in the country because that's too expensive. But we can now afford it. So it's shown people that it's never been the cost that's the real problem. It's been the political will to do it. And the other thing to really remember is that with all these civil rights and social justice issues, is that it's never just a just me thing. It's always a everybody thing. So when we obtained voting rights for, you know, that were led by the Black community in the 60s, it did not just benefit Blacks, it benefited everybody. You know, Asians, Latinos, poor whites, all the people who had been kept out of the voting process benefited from that. When we ended the discriminatory immigration laws in the 60s, it didn't just benefit, you know, Asians, it benefited Africans and Central Americans as well. So whenever we, you know, advance the rights of anybody, it helps everybody. So we need to get into that mindset of, you know, we're not in it just for ourselves. We're in it to be a better community, a better country, a better society. And, you know, that's what we're working for, is for each other, not just myself.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you so much. Yeah. I think it's good time to move for the kind of open conversation now for Q&A session. Like I found one question like Theo, sorry, Theo B. Do you know her name? Elaine, like a Theo B. Elaine, I loved hearing that you feel that street action makes a difference. How would you respond to someone saying that protest won't work in 2020? Like, Theo, if you can
Yeah, I mean, I
join the conversation.
I'm sure, people say that, that history doesn't prove that at all. I think that, as Stan and I have talked about, if not for the protests out on the street, nothing would have really happened. I mean, it's true that a lot of people worked inside the system to get a lot of the changes, but if it wasn't for the actions out in the street, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the riots and Martin Luther King, that was all out on the streets to really press for these changes. So I think that the protests that are going on right now is really important. The street action. It's got to be with strategy, but I think that it's too simplistic, because back then when we were putting demands forward, it was pretty black and white. It was like, okay, we want this, we want that. It's more multi-layered and complex, I think, now with climate change and the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter and all of that. There's so many issues, but I think that the protests are good. They don't have to look exactly like back in the day, but I don't see anything really happening if there won't be people massively protesting out on the streets. It just won't get the attention. But so we need the people on the inside too, to do the work, and the legislators, and the president and on down. I mean, it's multifaceted and strategies, but the protests on the street, I think, is just absolutely the key.
Anything to add, Stan?
Well, Jen, yeah, I agree with Elaine, but so one thing I would add is that you need both, because without the action on the streets, you wouldn't, like, there wouldn't be a debate going on in Seattle right now about, should we shift money in the city budget from the police into social services? I mean, that would not even be on the table if there had not been massive street protests, right? So the street protests are kind of the trigger that get things in motion and cause people to say, we need to rethink, we need a different way of approaching this. But the way that the system changes is by changing policy. And policy gets set by the city council, the county council, the mayor, the president, by elected officials, and by kind of the social conscience of society overall. So you've got to shift both of those, kind of public opinion as well as how people in power actually will vote to set new policies.
But do you think for your case, like the 70s, 80s, like a street protest kind of moved to actual, you guys won the fundings from, local government. Like what was the, key of the success back then? Maybe Elaine, can you?
Well, they always say politics is local, so a lot of the street actions and whatnot that happen in the cities, they're following up, with the local officials. I agree with, Stan, that, policies get set and who sets the policies. And, really, a lot of the, if you want to get into electoral politics and whatnot, we can say we don't like the electoral voting system, which is really not working. We know that, but the reality is who are the ones that vote. Look at the demographics of who votes. So, but I think that the actions that we took back in those days, I think it was a little simpler time. I think that, you know, there was a lot of injustices going on and there were a lot of different movements. I think Stan and I had talked about before, you know, that when we were working on a lot of issues, you know, there was the women's rights issues going on, you know, there was a lot of immigrant rights. There's a lot of international issues going on, you know, there was, you know, the South Africa apartheid issues going on and lots of internationalist work that was going on. There was labor organizing going on. You know, there was, you know, you know, mentioned, you know, the murders of Jean Viernes and Selmy Domingo. You know, they were union activists in Seattle, and they were one of the forefront leaders of the union movement. So there's a lot of street action and movements and protests that were going on different issues, and I don't see it really any different. You know, and then you still got to work within the system to get the changes too, and they're not um, going to be revolutionary changes, but you know, they're, you know, incremental changes as you keep going along, and that's how we worked at you know, in the local community.
Works today too.
Yeah, and I would say the struggle is always on multiple levels. So there's the street level, there's the electoral level, and like Elaine was mentioning, there's also labor side of things and immigrant side of things. So like another group I'm involved with is APALA, Asian Pacific American Labor Association, who works closely with groups like LILO and locally. And so there's the other difference is there's more organizations that exist now than there were in the 60s and 70s. So like, you know, in the 60s, almost none of the organizations we see in the international district existed in the early 60s. Most of them were sprung up in the mid to late 60s or early 70s. So they're all like celebrating their 40th, 45th anniversary these days. So that helps, is that there's these community organizations that can look after certain issues, but they're usually limited in scope. Like ICHS looks at health issues, and Interim CDA looks at more like housing and development issues. And APALA looks mainly at labor issues. So one thing we need to do is have a broader coalition efforts so that we can not get too focused in on our one little lane that we're in, but so that we can, you know, broaden it so that the whole highway to change is opened up and not just one little lane here and another little lane there.
Yeah, I'd like to share two more questions. One kind of coming up right now. Past activism was greatly supported by the movement of then activists into the system, such as the election of Alan Sugiyama to the Seattle School Board, if I recall. Today, landscape would not look the same if persons like Elaine, Stanley Shikuma, and their colleagues were not willing to stay and serve our community over the gate. Any comments on that?
Well, I'm trying to understand the comment. I think the activism, you know, Al Sugiyama is a good example. Larry Gossett is as well, you know, with the Black Panthers Party, and Alan Sugiyama started the Oriental Students Union at Seattle Community College. He was really key activist out on the streets, and then, you know, get elected to the school board was really significant. You know, now there is a school that's either already been named after him, you know, really one of the key leaders. So yeah, I think working in the system as well as out makes a big difference. I know Al Sugiyama had made a huge difference by being on the school board, and others as well, you know, who have, Dolores Sabonga was the first Filipino woman, you know, to graduate from law school, the UW, back in the day when that wasn't very common, and also was our first Seattle City Councilwoman, and she did a lot for the community. And so, yeah, I mean, it's important to have, you know, this representation, even more so today.
Thank you. Um, the other question from Harry. Asian American community and the whole nation, we should be united, not divided. What can we do to keep our government from making the same mistake? How can we pass the history lesson and truth to our history lesson and then truth to our next generation to come?
Well, I think one key thing is education, because like actually that's come up even within the presidential races. Like, you know, Trump wants to go back to whatever time he thinks was great and not teach basically ethnic studies. So I think being truthful about our history, not just looking at the good things or the whitewashed version of history, but looking at, you know, how things actually went down, who actually suffered, who actually benefited, and how does that affect where we are today, impact where we are today. It's really important for people to understand that, because if you have this idealized and wrong, basically factually wrong version of history in your mind, then A, you won't see any need to change anything. B, if you do see a need to change something, you won't know what to change or how to change it to make it better. And, you know, if you don't know your past, you're not going to be able to develop a clearer, better future. So I think education is a key thing. And there's other things, but maybe Elaine can cover that.
Thank you. And now, like some people has left, so not many on here. So any of you are welcome to unmute and join the conversation if you have comments or conversation.
Yeah, I want to just also, on a personal note, you know, there's a lot of activists in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, okay. I guess somebody tried to throw a question, unmuted. Oh, okay. Sorry, go ahead, Elaine.
Okay, so yeah, you know, education as Stan's saying, but you know, if you really look at the history, there's a lot of great leaders that were really paved the way, you know, even in the 50s and the 60s in the Asian community. And, you know, it wasn't just, it was all the different, they were all different races, you know, and I think the young people can learn from a lot of the activists. And it's similar because it's stepping out in front, you know, and but at the time that was not something I know that there's this one individual, for example, he was Japanese American, Nisei, and he has passed away. So again, they're not around to share their stories because they're not here anymore. But Reverend Min Katahiri, he was very key in the civil rights in the 60s at that time. And I read that, you know, he helped start the first gay rights organization in the 60s. And that's like way back in the 60s. And, you know, there's a lot of those activist leaders that really did a lot. And the young people, we could all learn from, you know, what they did. But at the same time, you know, the young people are very, very, very sharp. And they do have access to a lot of information. And as Stan's saying, you know, we just hope that the really young ones in school will get the right information and right education. And that's a challenge.
Yeah. And I would add that young people are the hope for the future, right? Because, you know, hate to say it, but Elaine and I are both getting a little on in years. So I don't know how you feel, but
students
you know,
are joining this session, like somebody wanna kind of show question, like please feel free. Unmute it.
Young people.
And some are Japanese expats, and I think some are students from Seattle.
Yeah, remember Martin Luther King Jr. was in his 30s when he was assassinated. So all of the work he did was late 20s and through his late 30s. He was young. John Lewis, when he was out there marching with Dr. King, he was really young, like he was in his 20s. So I think people need to realize that you don't have to be my age in order to be a leader or to be an activist or to come up with great ideas.
Right.
So start early.
And activism does take a lot of different forms. It doesn't have to look like our stereotype of what it should look like. You know, there's a lot of people that are doing good work for social justice, and a lot of young people, and that's great. It all helps.
Thank you so much, Elaine and Stan, for today. Okay, I got the last question from Ms. S. Okay, can you read this? Right. Great. Former Wing Luke Museum Director Sancho has recently released a memoir that covers some silence of history discussed here. Okay, there are a few published resources there about Seattle activists. This is one to check out. The book is called Forgotten Seattle, and it's published by the International Examiner. Yeah, thank you for the information. Thank you. Okay, if it's getting time, almost 6:15, so I'd like to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining our panel today. At the last, I'd like to kind of ask for if during this pandemic time, if any of you can subscribe to North American Post, which is $46 annually, and your subscription really help us to keep going during pandemic. So if you go to nf.com, you can go to online subscription there. So your subscription is really appreciated. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.